This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. Today's episode is a little bit different. My longtime partners and collaborators at the Nature Conservancy recently launched a great new podcast series called On the Move, hosted by TNC storyteller Leah Palmer. It's all about wild animals, their migrations, and the people working to keep those journeys wild and free. If you're a longtime Mountain and Prairie listener, then many of these people, places, and conservation issues will be familiar to you. In fact, a few of the experts you'll hear over the course of the full series are past Mountain and Prairie guests, including Sammy Matsaw Jr., Kelsey Malloy, and Nancy Fishbein. So I'm excited to share one of my favorite episodes today, episode 4, called Distance Champions. This episode is about creatures of the sky, sandhill cranes, greater sage-grouse, Wilson's phalaropes, and it digs into why these birds migrate, how new tracking technology reveals where they actually go, and what stands in their way. You'll also hear from Ted Floyd of the American Birding Association, who's a good friend of TNC here in Colorado. A big thanks to the Nature Conservancy for creating such an interesting and engaging podcast series. If you enjoy it, go subscribe to On the Move and listen to the whole series. And as always, thanks to everyone who supports Mountain and Prairie via Patreon and additional podcast support from the Free Flow Institute, the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, and the Well Done Foundation. And with that, here's Leah Palmer and the On the Move podcast. Hope you enjoy.
I love the dance between science and wonder. And, sometimes I kind of treat them as like one and the same. And sometimes it's like you need to keep them separate. I mean, to some extent, wonder and science are different human expressions. But I'm more struck by how much overlap there is between the two of them. So like in the same breath, in the same sentence, in the same thought, you'll have sort of a scientific thought about how on earth birds even do this. And at the same time, just be, enthralled by the marvel of it all.
Welcome back to On the Move, a podcast about wild animals, their amazing migrations, and the people working to free them up from anything standing in their way. Today we play in the gray area where science and wonder mix by turning our eyes to the sky. Stay tuned as I talk with top experts about birds, including sandhill crane, the greater sage-grouse, and Wilson's phalaropes. We learn about why they migrate, how researchers know exactly where they're going with real-time precision, and what obstacles they face along the way. You were just listening to my first guest, Ted Floyd. Ted is editor of Birdin' Magazine, an awarded publication of the American Birding Association. He's authored more than 200 articles on birds and natural history. He's written 8 books, including the Smithsonian Field Guide to Birds in North America, National Geographic's Field Guide to the Birds of the United States and Canada, and one titled How to Know the Birds. Ted is also a beloved friend of the Nature Conservancy in Colorado, often leading birding events at Zapata Ranch, where he goes to view sandhill crane. We'll get to that in a moment, but for now, here's more from Ted on the serendipity of birds.
What is just so appealing to me about bird watching, this may be the greatest appeal of all, is the serendipity in bird watching. You might think, after you've been doing this for 45 years, like I have, that it would get kind of predictable and rote and maybe even stale. And I suppose it could become that way if you just always walked the same path and looked for the same bird and read the same books and talked to the same people. Perhaps it would become very rote and predictable, but I avoid that. And what's just so gratifying to me is that an encounter with the most ordinary of birds, I'll throw out some names here, American robin, blue jay, European starling, house sparrow, Canada goose. These are really, 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 really familiar birds. And I've seen all of them thousands of times, can also just yield some kind of like serendipitous insight or experience, or just maybe like a new angle on the wonder of watching even the most common bird. So, by the way, a part of serendipity, of course, is finding the rare bird. And birders love to find rare birds. And that's one of the most wonderful, kind of maybe one of the most obvious forms of serendipity, seeing a species of bird that you just aren't expecting at all. I love going out at night because, birds don't go away at nighttime. And there are owls and other night birds at night, but it's so neat to sometimes hear like migratory birds flying over at night. Our migrating birds, ones we sort of think of during the daytime hours, are flying over at night. It's just so wonderful to hear their calls above the rooftops or above their treetops. So there's, I'll say nighttime birding is an especially wonderful and serendipitous experience for me.
Well, that sounds lovely. I personally consider myself an amateur birder, and I hear you reflecting back to me some of the things I love most about having my eyes in the sky, which is the sounds of birds and being able to identify what birds they belong to. And also just the common occurrence of a wren at my window or a house finch. But you're so right. We were joining today to talk about migratory birds. And so thanks for that segue. So what have you learned from witnessing the migrations that some birds go through?
Another big question. So you said, what have I learned? I mean, that could be interpreted as me personally, or also sort of like what have ornithologists and even humanity learned. I'm actually going to go a little bit in that direction, although I'll make this personal. So one of my very earliest experiences when I was still in high school was volunteering in a research lab at a university that was world renowned for studying migration. But their study system was unexpected. It was pigeons, common city pigeons. So pigeons don't migrate the way I think most of us think of migrations, but they certainly are superb navigators. They can fly hundreds of miles and they know exactly where they're going. And it was so cool to me. And what I really started to pick up on, even as a high school student, was that by studying migration, we really kind of understand how the world works, how the universe around us operates. Birds are capable of perceiving the environment in ways that we can't at all. They can see polarized light. They can sense the Earth's magnetic field. They can see colors like both in the infrared and the ultraviolet that we cannot see. So kind of like, I know we can't really, literally, physically, in a sensory way, see the world or hear the world the way that birds do, but understanding that birds have this sensory world that is in some ways much grander than ours is I guess it's humbling, but also it's inspiring, to understand that there's so much out there. So the idea that these birds just, get all over the planet with so little advanced training or anything like that is so amazing to me. We have a species of bird here in Colorado where I live, the Swainson's hawk, and it's maybe like my poster child for a bird that just never ceases to amaze me. So the young Swainson's hawks fledge like July, maybe even let's say July, and then the parents leave soon thereafter. So the young birds are left to their own devices, and they're just a few weeks old. And by the time they're only like 6 or 7 weeks old, they migrate all by themselves to Argentina. So, and I love to compare that with like a human being. Well, they can't even migrate across the room because they can't crawl or do anything at that point yet. And if you told you or me, hey, just find your way down to Argentina. You don't get an airplane. You don't get, any technology. Just get down to Argentina. And they do that, when they are literally, 2 months old. So that's just like, I do understand the science of how they're capable of doing that. It involves instinct. It also involves very, very rapid learning. It involves paying attention to what other birds are doing. So they sort of go with the flow and follow other birds flying south. So that's the science. But it is just so amazing to me that this bird that was hatched just months earlier is on its way down to Argentina. I find it so amazing.
Okay, so I've heard that you're a big fan of the sandhill crone and enjoy spotting them in Colorado on the Zapata Ranch Preserve, which is one of the Nature Conservancy's preserves. Would you tell me a bit about a memorable time that you've had witnessing the sandhill crane?
I'm very happy to do that. I also kind of want to, I hope we can go back to your question about the broader migratory strategies of the sandhill crane, because they are very complex, but also really intriguing and worth talking about. So, the Zapata Ranch is in south central Colorado in the San Luis Valley. I like to think of it as the other Colorado. And what I mean by that is I think everybody sort of knows about the mountains, the ski resorts, the ski towns, and then the whole Denver metro region, Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, et cetera, and then the plains farther east. But the San Luis Valley is this huge high plateau in neither the Colorado River drainage to the west or the Platte and Arkansas River drainages to the east. It's in the Rio Grande drainage, actually. So it has a very, very different flavor, very, very different feel. It's sort of high and dry. The precipitation there is minimal. It's a high desert. And sandhill cranes find their way to the Zapata Ranch, again, which is in the San Luis Valley, every year. The gathering in the early part of the year, so it's very early spring. It starts in February, actually, and really peaks in March and is pretty much over by about mid-April, is the one that attracts so many people, myself included. So what happens is that the cranes, and there actually are several populations of the sandhill crane, and the ones in the San Luis Valley are referred to as the greater sandhill crane. So they're the really big ones. So they've been wintering in New Mexico and Arizona and also northwestern Mexico. And then they fly north into the San Luis Valley where the Zapata Ranch is. And due to, I would say, aggressive and enlightened land management, the whole habitat there is made very suitable for them. And the birds fuel up there because they need to acquire additional energy to make the trip farther north in the year. So they're basically just sort of chilling. They're hanging out in the San Luis Valley. And there are several refuges there that are open to the public and where the cranes gather in large numbers, high 4 digits, even low 5 digits, and anybody can go up to them and see them. The Zapata Ranch itself also has cranes moving through. Because there aren't really big wetlands on the Zapata Ranch proper, we usually see like maybe a few hundred on the ground, but it's really stirring to see them moving over. You can see them just flying over. Their calls carry at tremendous distances, as large as a sandhill crane is. I mean, they're actually about as tall as a short stature adult human. They're so high up that we can't even see them, but we hear them. They have this shrill, wild, bugling sound. If I had to come up with a short list, and I'm saying like 3 or 4 sounds that to me kind of capture the feeling of wilderness in North America. Okay, fine. Loons, wolves, and I put sandhill cranes right up there. It's just one of the most powerful and evocative sounds I can think of. So I'll go with the experience of just hearing them and squinting to barely see them as they fly over the Zapata Ranch. And of course, for the photographers, myself included, it's always so fun when a little flock lands on one of the ponds out there, and we can get pretty close and photograph them. Sometimes they're just lounging around, not doing much of anything, but they also have these elaborate courtship dances, and the pairs are already coupled by the time that they're staging at the Zapata Ranch. So you can see them engaging in these incredibly elaborate dances. They're often likened to ballet. And my only response to that is they have moves that are more impressive than any human dancer. And it's really stirring to see that as well.
Wow, that's incredible. I heard that those calls someone put it to me as being haunting, and that the dances were silly. But I love the way that you've painted that picture for me, because I myself have never seen this. I think I'm going to have to get out there one day.
So I'm with you on the haunting. Yeah, the silly, I guess silliness is in the eye of the beholder, but they're very elaborately choreographed. Yes, it involves birds bowing and sort of weaving and spreading their wings and hopping up, but the just the athleticism that's involved in them is amazing. So maybe human dance is silly looking as well, but I'd say that the birds, I guess I bristle a little bit at silly. I'm really kind of amazed by the athleticism and the choreography of it all, and it's really stirring to watch that. And they do that for minutes at a time, and then they'll just sort of calm down. So the dance isn't just a short duration caper. It can go on for quite all. Oh, and at the same time that they dance, they typically will call as well. So you get the best of both worlds. You get their evocative, haunting calls and their, let's say, athletic dancing at the same time.
Beautiful. I love the way you've put it. I wanted to dig in a little bit more on something you mentioned earlier about their migration strategy. You used that word. And I'm curious what drives and motivates these birds to migrate over such a long distance.
Yeah, so that's complicated. I actually teach an entire course on why birds migrate, and we spend pretty much the whole semester looking at that. So the sort of easy answer, and it's a little bit circular because you might wonder, well, how did this arise in the first place, is that they're going to and coming from places where resources are favorable. So you mentioned sandhill cranes breeding in the northern United States and Canada and Alaska. Actually, I just want to point out, they get a lot farther than that. So many of the lesser sandhill cranes, that's not the population in Colorado, that's the population that famously stages on the Platte River in Nebraska. They actually cross the Bering Strait and get several thousand miles way into Russia. And I'm not talking about like the Russian Far East. I'm talking like over near Finland. I mean, that's how far they keep going. So sandhill cranes, especially the lesser population, the one that occurs generally east of the San Luis Valley, is just a staggering migrate. But when you think about it, so we're talking right now during the winter months, that habitat would be completely inaccessible to a crane right now. It's frozen and solid. There's nothing out there. They eat, live animal matter, which is buried under snow and ice right now. So they can't spend the winter up there. So they go much, much farther south and east to like Texas and Mexico and places like that. But during the summer months, the resources aren't really good for the cranes to stick around there. So they go all the way back to Siberia and even points west of Siberia. So again, it's a little bit of a circular answer, but the birds go to where the food is. And I also love to point out that it's not because they get cold. Like we get cold, humans get cold. We evolved in equatorial East Africa. We're not adapted truly for cold weather. Birds are like totally capable of handling the cold. So if there were food in Russia in the winter, and also and in Alaska and Canada, I should be fair, they're also in North America, they'd stay there. But because there's not, they go farther south. So the cranes don't get cold, they get hungry. And I think that resource availability, and in particular food availability, is maybe what drives bird migration more than anything else. That applies to all birds, but in the case of the cranes, it applies especially to the cranes. Just finally, because I teased this several times now, I just want to point out that sandhill cranes are extremely complicated at the population structure level. So we have two main groups and then 4 or 5 sort of subgroups of sandhill cranes. And the ones in Colorado, where I realize we're sort of focusing here, are the greater sandhill cranes. And despite their name greater, they're actually the ones that migrate the shortest. It's the lesser sandhill cranes that migrate the particularly long distances. So the greater sandhill cranes are basically animals of Western North America. They're going to be breeding in Western Canada and the Northwestern U.S., and then wintering in the Western U.S., Southwestern U.S. really, and Northwestern Mexico. It's the lesser sandhill cranes that are just these incredible long-distance world champion migrants, and that's a different population of sandhill cranes.
These long-distance champions are fascinating, but along their amazing journey, they are faced with obstacles. So I asked Ted to tell me a little bit more about this.
So let's talk about barriers. So birds have gone past a barrier that's a barrier to almost every other organism except for flying insects, which is the ability to disperse tremendous distances. So they have wings, they use them, their wings carry them fast and far. So it's just easier for a bird to, literally get across the globe than it would be for a turtle or a land-based organism. So they're capable of traversing tremendous distances, and most of them do some variation on that. I also want to point out that there's some sort of good old-fashioned hazards as well. So collisions with buildings and other structures, with energy infrastructure, for example, loss of habitat. So in the case of the cranes, it's not just about where they nest and where they winter. It's also about where they stop to refuel. So let's just imagine that the Zapata Ranch weren't there, and bigger picture that the San Luis Valley weren't there. Well, where would these poor cranes go? They can't make the journey uninterrupted. They have to stop and fuel. So that's really more of a habitat story than anything else. However, something's going on with cranes that's not bad for the cranes per se, but it really does get at a problem with many, many other birds, and it's that the timing of their migration is rapidly responding to climate change. So we're seeing cranes earlier and earlier in the spring in Colorado. In fact, they're starting to show up in winter, in February, and then they're coming back later and later in the late summer and fall, and even sort of almost into early winter. So their migration's being prolonged at both ends. The cranes are adapting fine to that, actually. But many other birds face a really, really worrisome problem, which is that the timing of the resources that they critically depend on is becoming asynchronous with or decoupled from the timing of their migration. So I think of the example of migrating songbirds, especially in the eastern U.S. and eastern Canada, that they're getting back earlier and earlier in the spring, but not early enough. So the plants, like the trees, are budding earlier and earlier, and the caterpillars are not really adjusting to this earlier phenology. We say that's basically the timing of when the leaves start coming out on the plant. So everything's out of whack. So the birds show up, but the caterpillars aren't there, but the leaves are already on the tree, and any particular organism by itself is kind of doing okay. The birds can still fly, the caterpillars can still eat, the trees still have leaves, but they've been very, very, very sort of perfectly fine-tuned through the ages, and now everything's out of sync, and the birds show up and they don't have food, or the caterpillars come out and the leaves aren't the right shade of green, and that actually makes a big difference for the caterpillars. So that's a big problem with a lot of birds. Cranes are adaptable, and here in the United States, our common widespread wild crane, which is the sandhill crane, I'll be cautiously optimistic here. It's doing well. It's not hunted the way that it used to be. There's widespread public interest in the welfare of the birds. Everybody from like landowners to state and federal conservation agencies are getting together to help the cranes out. I should say that crane populations elsewhere, for example, in East Asia and parts of Africa, are imperiled. But we're doing a good job in the United States and Canada with our sandhill cranes. We do have another crane, the whooping crane. It does not occur in Colorado, which is much, much, much rarer. It was almost extinguished in the 20th century. It's slowly recovering. The whooping crane has a ways to go, but I'd say, again, cautiously, optimistically, that things are looking okay for the whooping crane and are looking good, actually, for the sandhill crane.
Wow. Well, I imagine that there might be some listeners who are flirting with the idea of becoming a birder, or at least just like opening their eyes or looking up, sort of like we discussed earlier in our conversation, and noticing birds or noticing bird calls. And I was just curious if you might have some words of wisdom for people who are hoping to become involved in birding.
Sure. Well, that's what my whole career is about. I could spend a lot of time with you on this one, but let me try to distill it to a few essential points here. So the great thing about birds, maybe more than any other class of animal on Earth, is that they're everywhere. Whether you are in the biggest of cities or the most wild of wilderness areas, whether you're on a ship at sea, whether you're in Antarctica, there are birds everywhere to be seen. So never mind being a birder, whatever that means, but just like being a bird enjoyer, a bird lover. It's as simple as going outside. By the way, you don't even have to go outside. You can open up your window and look at and listen to birds. So they are absolutely everywhere. And I find that almost immediately we're struck by how many kinds there are. Let's just picture like a walk in a big city. Let's go for like a really big city like New York or Philadelphia or somewhere like that. You will see a whole lot of birds just walking a mile in the city. And not just all the same pigeons and sparrows and starlings. You'll see gulls and geese and robins and other songbirds. And so there's just a diversity of birds everywhere you go. I find that bird watchers almost always, I won't say always, but almost always want to know the names of what the birds are. So we certainly have traditional resources like some excellent field guides that are just, I'm amazed at how good some of our really, really, really good field guides are. So they're books that are just intended for quick reference and easy identification of the common birds in your area. Certainly at the present age, digital resources, apps, but also online resources, Birds of the World, eBird, iNaturalist are increasingly an incredibly good way to learn about birds. But I will also go in the opposite direction and say that as amazing as these books are, as amazing as these digital resources are, nothing beats human companionship. And I don't just mean for the value and virtue of being around people. That's a cool thing. Yeah. But just for knowledge. We can, when we're just reading books, when we're just downloading apps, when we're online all the time, we can miss some pretty obvious stuff. And I find that just hanging out with another birder is probably the best thing of all. Other than watching the birds themselves, probably the second best thing you do is find other bird watchers. And what's so wonderful, birding really everywhere. I mean, I'm thinking of the United States, but certainly Canada, Mexico, all over the Americas right now. There are so many bird clubs, birding organizations, bird societies, and some of them are kind of formal and they've been around for a long time, but many are just these sort of casual meetup groups. And in general, if you see a bird watcher out there, just stop them, tell them, hey, I'm curious, what bird are you looking at? And you may find yourself sucked into a conversation that takes up the whole day. Bird watchers love to share about the birds they're seeing. So I'd say go outside, or if you can't get outside, open up the window, look around, be aware of the really good books and digital resources are out there, and try to find other people, like real people in real life, like to hang out with outdoors and look at birds together with. And I think you'll find that the rabbit hole that you've gone down is one that will consume you for the rest of your life. Bird watching really can become all consuming. And for all of us who have gone down that rabbit hole, it's a wonderful rabbit hole to have gone down indeed. Hey, I also just wanted to mention that another question that arises a lot is, okay, so now you're into birds. Like, is it good for you? Is it good for the environment? Is it good for the birds? And for the answer is sort of yes, yes, and yes. I think that people who are aware of birds become aware of the environment and are inevitably led toward stewardship of the environment. That's sort of an easy thing to say. I find that many people become quite powerfully attracted to the sort of the scientific aspect of bird watching. What we've really, really, really come to appreciate, especially since the pandemic, is the incredible value of bird watching for wellness. And this is not just sort of like some la la hoo hoo woo woo, go watch the birds and you'll feel better. Although that's true, the science behind this is extraordinary. There's some really, really cool papers, and this is based on serious university research with brain imaging and brain scans of like the value of experiencing wonder. And it doesn't have to be birds. It could be the night sky. It could be an incredible sunset or scenery, or the mountains here in Colorado. But watching birds is really, really good for you as well. It's like physically and mentally good for you. In addition to, in my mind, being just a intellectually and artistically very stimulating thing to do as well.
That's great. Well, I have you here, and so I'm going to ask some questions I'm curious about. What's your favorite bird?
Oh my goodness, my favorite bird. So I'm an equal opportunity bird lover. It's a little bit of a cliche, but sort of whatever bird is in front of me is probably the one that is my favorite. But let me actually answer that question with, I'm going to go in two directions. I'm going to first say the American robin. It's maybe the most cliched bird in the United States and Canada. They're absolutely everywhere, right. But they're big and bold and brilliant and sassy and tame and incredibly easy to observe. And I actually wrote a little essay once called 30 Seconds with a Robin. It was literally a 30-second video, and how, like, if we parse that video apart, like, there's an entire book of natural history that you can learn from watching a robin for 30 seconds. So I'll go with the robin just because it's such a easy to find bird. Almost everybody in the U.S. and Canada, except for Hawaii, although there's some cool birds in Hawaii too, has access to robins at some time of the year. And even though I've been watching robins for my whole life, like, I still learn from robins every time I see them. So I'll go with the robin. But I have another answer. It's a bird that probably most people haven't heard of. It's a very, very common bird in the western United States. It's called the bush tit. And it's this tiny, wee little brown and gray bird. It's almost colorless. It's drab. The eyes of the female are yellow. That's like the only way you can tell her from the male. But everything about the bush tit is just marvelous. Their social behaviors, the way they disperse, their breeding behavior is extremely complicated. Their vocalizations are strange, and they're just sort of out there doing their own thing. And you could go through life and never know that you probably see and hear. Again, if you're in the western United States, they're not the east. You might hear like 100 bush tits every day and not know about it. And that to me is this wonderful idea of like that there's this wonderful secret world out there that doesn't have to be a secret at all. And I just love the idea that these little bush tits are going about their business, doing all the cool things that bush tits do. And that, once we sort of caught the birding bug, we realized that these amazing little resourceful birds are actually smaller than some hummingbirds. They're the smallest songbird in the United States and Canada. They do their thing. They don't look like much. They don't sound like much. But once you sort of dig in and get into their behaviors, their lifestyles, their story. Oh, by the way, their resourcefulness and adaptability. This is a bird that's actually doing quite well, believe it or not, in the face of climate change, because they have figured out how to exploit new environments that are becoming available. as a result of climate change. Now, I don't want to say that that's always the case. With most birds, it's the other way around. But the resourcefulness of the bush tit is another. So two answers. The robin, because anybody can go out and see a robin and instantly just like get into robins and learn so much about them. And if you want to take it to the next level, the bush tit, which is just this little bird that's all over the West. Nobody seems to know about it, and they do such cool things.
Thank you for indulging me. I cannot wait to go find your essay with about 30 Seconds with a Robin. I went searching and found Ted's essay published by the American Birding Association titled How to Know the Birds, number 33, 30 Intense Seconds with an Extreme Robin. And you can find a link in the show notes if you'd like to read it. Ted tells me he wrote this essay
during like the worst days of the pandemic. Because like everybody else, I couldn't really get outside the neighborhood. we weren't able to, to travel for the most part at all. And although I certainly loved robins going into that experience, I probably spent more quality time with robins during the pandemic than at any other time in my life.
For the end of our conversation, Ted left me with what I think is an important note for all of us.
Given where we are in human history right now, it feels that birding is having a moment, as they say. I think more people are getting into bird watching than ever before. We're still sort of feeling this echo effect from the pandemic, with a lot of people being attracted to bird watching for the wellness component of it. Also very gratifying is that birding until fairly recently was a little bit of an, I want to be careful sort of how I word this here, but a little bit like a East Coast elite, sort of older, more affluent hobby. And that's really changing now. We're finding just that very predictably, anybody can see a bird or hear a bird if you can't see, detect a bird in some way or another. There's this very, very gratifying sort of broadening of the base of bird watchers to include almost everybody. So I love that people are being attracted to birds for wellness reasons. And even more so, I love the fact that bird watching seems to be more appreciated and better engaged by a broader swath of our society than ever before. If I actually might address the maybe establishment birdwatching community out there, I think it's really valuable that persons in that community, to some extent, learn to let go a little bit. Birdwatching is for everyone, and I think that there's no correct way to go birdwatching. If it involves enjoyment, if it involves getting outside and feeling the sunshine on your skin and breathing fresh air and listening to birdsong and looking at the colors of birds, there's no community, no group has exclusive proprietorship to that blessing, to that wonder. And I think that just recognizing and accepting that people will enjoy birds for that very sort of basic reason, and then maybe go off in directions that we who have been doing this for a long time might not have conceived of, is something that I think in some ways we're responsible for doing. But on the other hand, I think we actually might benefit from that. We might ourselves learn an awful lot from. There are many, many different ways of engaging, not just birds, but wildlife and really the entire material universe around us.
Yeah. Nature's for us all. And what a gift we all have.
Yep, for sure.
Thank you so much, Ted. I deeply appreciate your time and all the energy and insight you brought to this conversation about birds, and especially the sandhill crane in Colorado. I thank you for coming and joining me.
Thanks very much for having me. I had a great time talking to you. Thanks.
Support comes from the Nature Conservancy. In the Colorado River Basin, we're restoring streams, securing water for nature and communities, and protecting habitat for wildlife, including migrating birds. Learn more at nature.org/Colorado River. Next up, I got curious about the greater sage-grouse. I reached out to Kelsey Malloy, the Northern Great Plains Director for the Nature Conservancy in Montana, to learn about a bird that's on my bucket list to spot one day. I know already that they have a distinctive call and iconic appearance. This bird flaunts a spiky fan of tail feathers and an inflatable yellow sac on its chest. I wonder if one reason I've yet to see a grouse is because they are one of 340 imperiled species native to the sagebrush sea. The sagebrush sea is the largest terrestrial ecosystem in the lower 48. It spans 150 million acres across 14 states in the western U.S. and 3 Canadian provinces. It plays a vital role in the region's ecology, economy, and cultural identity. The sagebrush sea's beauty is unparalleled. Vast plains carpeted with blue-green sage, wildflowers, and bunch grass all capped by majestic and dynamic skies. But invasive grasses and a changing climate are quickly causing the iconic landscape to vanish. And with it, keystone species like the greater sage-grouse are under threat. In recent years, grouse have faced a decline in numbers that correlates with loss of their habitat. They once totaled as many as 16 million birds found throughout the United States, but today their numbers have dwindled to less than 200,000. So I sat down with Kelsey to learn more about the bird and how people across the West are working together to protect this migrating species. Here's Kelsey.
So sage-grouse are chicken-sized, I would say. Although sometimes you see them and they look like a pretty big chicken. They're pretty cool because they're like so highly tied to the sagebrush ecosystem. And so even though there's some like variability in their habitat, there always has to be sagebrush. They're just like super adapted to their environment. I've seen them sometimes in the winter where there's just like a little bit of snow on the landscape and they're in amongst the sagebrush and their camouflage is so good you can barely see them. And basically all they eat in the winter is sagebrush. One other adaptation they have is that most animals do not eat sagebrush because it's full of chemicals that they can't process. And so sage-grouse actually secrete something called cecal tar. It's this black stuff that comes out of them in addition to their poop. And that's like all the chemicals that were in the sagebrush leaves that they excrete separately and are able to process. So it's like just kind of this cool evolutionary trait. And another thing that a lot of people know sage-grouse for is their mating display. Grouse have something called a lek, or a dancing ground, where they go and do this kind of funky display. The males will puff up their chests and then they have these air sacs that make this booming sound. And so it's like you can hear them from, a half mile away. And it's really cool to watch in the spring, see their display. And they're very site faithful. So like sage-grouse go back to the same lek every year. If I go out and look at a sage-grouse lek this April, that bird's ancestors were probably at that same exact location 300 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So it's pretty cool that they're really tied to their homes.
I know they're unique in the way that they migrate. Can you tell me a little about how their movements work?
Yeah. So sage-grouse are super cool because here in Montana, we often think of them as being resident birds because they are here all year, even in the winter. But they actually have smaller seasonal migrations. I'll talk mostly about what's happening here in eastern Montana, but they actually have different migration patterns depending on where they are. And so a population in Utah might have a different migration pattern than one in Idaho, and it's all about moving seasonally to access the resources they need. A lot of sage-grouse populations will have a small migration in the summer. So in the spring, right, they're on the leks, which are their dancing grounds. The males dance and breed with females. They have nests, they have chicks. Once the chicks are able to move, the females will move them to a wetland area, an area that's fairly green. Sometimes those are like hay meadows or just naturally occurring wetlands to access food, fresh green material and insects. Depending on where you are, that could be a fairly long migration, like maybe 10 miles, or it could just be they're moving, a mile away to the next wetland. So maybe that's not a migration per se, but they have these like seasonal movements. In Phillips County, Montana, our sage-grouse are having a small seasonal movement where they're moving to thicker sagebrush in the winter. But then we also have birds from Canada and northern Phillips and Valley County that are using a different sagebrush type. So it's this silver sagebrush habitat. It has a lot less sagebrush. And when it gets covered in snow, there's not really shelter or food for them. And so they'll actually migrate up to 100 miles from Canada into the U.S. to access our Wyoming big sagebrush habitat, which are these bigger sagebrush plants that provide more cover. And in the winter, 100% of their diet is sagebrush. That's all they're eating. I think it's the longest documented sage-grouse migration that's actually coming across the border. Sage-grouse are listed as endangered in Canada, so it's extra important that we keep our habitat good here so that they have a place to go in the winter and can survive and go back in the spring, because we're kind of helping support the population on both sides of the border.
As we talked, I learned the greater sage-grouse is truly threatened. So I asked Kelsey what humans can be doing to give this amazing species a chance.
Yeah, I would say, truly the biggest thing is just keeping that sagebrush habitat intact. Because they're so site faithful, that can also be their downfall in that it's hard for them to adapt. We've seen leks kind of blink out where there's increased crop development or oil and gas development or, anything that's enough development to kind of push them away. They can't just go somewhere else. They can't be like, oh, this isn't really suitable anymore, we're going to go elsewhere. They're kind of tied to that location. So if that location's no longer good habitat, they're more prone to predation, and eventually they die out and we lose them entirely. So that's the biggest thing, is just like these large intact ecosystems, which can make it kind of daunting when you're just like a ordinary person, because you're kind of disconnected from that. We need policy that encourages thoughtful development, tools like conservation easements, federal agencies that are considering these species when they're doing work. So it's kind of like big picture solutions to keep them going.
Growing up in the plains of Oklahoma and spending summers in the Southwest, I have always embraced the beauty of tall grass, prairies, and sagebrush. These places reveal subtle wonder, and they can make you feel breathtakingly small amidst vast landscape. They are truly the heartland, sustaining birds, mammals, reptiles, and pollinators who, in turn, keep a balanced ecosystem for communities who live and work on the land. Still, they are often overlooked and are considered among the least protected and most at-risk ecosystems on the planet. Kelsey and I talked about how this habitat is broadly underappreciated while remaining critical to so many species and local communities.
So I think part of what I find really appealing about the grasslands is that all the species that live here are so resilient and uniquely adapted to their environment, because it is a pretty harsh environment. We're just a couple inches of rain away from it being a desert. Everything that lives here has to be able to survive negative 40 degrees and also 100 degrees and be able to survive this terrible wind that never stops. And, like the droughts. I kind of have a deep respect for all the wildlife and plants that live here, because they've spent eons adapting to be able to keep living here. I'm really impressed by all of them. Native prairie grasses are basically the base of this whole grassland and sagebrush ecosystem here. So actually where I live, we've been talking about sage-grouse and sagebrush, but we have more of a mixed ecosystem where we also have the strong grass component. Grass is basically what's keeping soil on the ground and not blowing in the air. It is a very windy landscape, and we would have a lot more wind erosion if we didn't have grass. So a lot of the grasses we have are deep-rooted. They can be, in some of the other prairie states, they've dug them down to 6 feet, the roots. It's incredible. And so actually 2/3 of a grass's production is underground. In addition to holding the soil in place, they're also providing the forage base for cattle, but also all the other wildlife that live here. Also, grass in these ecosystems is storing carbon in the soil. So as the grass's roots die underground, that's capturing carbon and storing it there. And so we basically have like ancient carbon stored in our prairie soils that is not released unless you plow it or disturb the soil in some way. Unlike in a forest, where if you have a wildfire, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. If a prairie fire rolls through, it just takes off this year's crop of grass, but all the carbon that's been stored in the soil is still there undisturbed. So they're really important places for carbon sequestration. And a lot of the ranchers we work with talk about grass as basically like converting solar energy into something that we can use. Grass is all these little solar panels out there, all these leaves collecting the sunlight and using its chlorophyll to turn it into plant matter that then cattle are able to eat, and then we can eat them, whereas we humans can't really eat grass. And so it's also, kind of this food source that then feeds us. Coming from the East Coast, I looked at habitat at this very small scale. And so coming here, a lot of these species that live here for some part of the year need hundreds and hundreds of acres of intact grassland for them to use that landscape. And so all of the species here are pretty sensitive to fragmentation, development, habitat loss. With sage-grouse, if there's more than 10% cropland on the landscape, their populations will disappear entirely. And so I would say it's the same for migrating birds, is that they're looking for intact landscapes.
In Montana, part of the Nature Conservancy's protection strategy for these places includes partnerships that ensure everything living here thrives, people and creatures alike. Montana's northern Great Plains encompasses some of the largest and most significant native grasslands remaining in the U.S. Despite this, grassland birds have been declining by more than 50% since the 1970s. The grasslands host all kinds of migrating species, which include pronghorn, elk, and our grouse. A lot of these lands are privately owned and worked by ranching and farming communities. But animals and ecosystems don't really care about ownership lines. So conservation is now working to span these boundaries. I asked Kelsey about the partnerships she and others at TNC have formed to benefit this mosaic of grass and sage steppe.
Everything that the Nature Conservancy does in Montana involves partnerships. We work with private landowners quite a bit, local ranchers. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about cattle grazing and sage-grouse. Cattle grazing can be a really important tool to manage grassland and sagebrush habitats. And at least in this landscape, this ecosystem has a long ecological history of grazing, currently by cattle, but also by bison, antelope, elk, rabbits, grasshoppers. So our sagebrush and grassland plants are pretty adapted to that disturbance. And so ranchers being here is actually really important because the alternative land use here is basically crop ground, and sage-grouse don't really use that as habitat. So we work with a lot of ranchers on conservation easements, which basically protects their property in perpetuity. They're able to continue grazing and using it for agriculture, but not plow it. And so we don't have that habitat loss.
What would cause a rancher to work for the benefit of sage-grouse, for instance? Like, are there co-benefits to the ranching community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I feel like here, one of the reasons I like my work and I feel very lucky here is that there's a lot of like win-win-win situations where if we have intact grasslands, those can support ranchers and a working lands economy. And also it can provide habitat for grassland birds, for sage-grouse, for antelope. And so a lot of times it's fairly easy to work with ranchers because it's like, we want the same thing, which is healthy grass on the landscape. And as a byproduct of that, we as the conservation groups also get to see wildlife. I think a lot of ranchers are interested and care about wildlife, but sometimes it does feel like a stretch as a conservation group to be like, hey, there's this other tiny brown bird we need you to care about. But it's like, we can say, hey, we want to see your ranch be successful into the future. Let's work together on a grazing project or an easement or a wetland restoration project. Like, there's a lot of potential for overlap. This landscape that I live in is very special, and there's been a lot of conservation attention on it for many years. There's actually a local group here called Ranchers Stewardship Alliance that has emerged as a group that's able to be at the table with conservation groups and like provide a voice for ranchers. And they've actually helped bring together some of the conservation groups to work together. So we've been working with them for a number of years on their conservation committee, doing a variety of projects. So they've gotten grant funding to do things like grassland restoration, improving fences to make them wildlife friendly, grazing management projects. And so they kind of are like this hub of partnerships where other conservation groups are working with them, they're working with landowners, and we're kind of all working together towards this big picture goal of having a healthy human community and healthy wildlife community.
That's really beautiful. I was going to ask you next, like, if you were looking back on your work, let's say 30, 40 years from now, what do you hope that you will look back on and celebrate?
That's a great question. I think two things. The first is I hope, 30 years from now, we look back and say that we were successful in keeping this landscape here, because it feels like if if we don't want this landscape to change, if we want there still to be wildlife and habitat, and we want people to be able to make a living kind of in harmony with their surroundings, that won't just happen on its own. We need to take action for that change to not happen. So that's one thing we want to see. What we have here, that's amazing, continue. We also, this is like a project that I'm really excited about right now, and I hope that it kind of grows. The Nature Conservancy owns a ranch here called the Matador Ranch. It's a 60,000 acre property. It's half public, half private. And we run it as a grass bank, which is kind of this idea of having multiple ranchers bring cattle, run their cattle together, which is not common practice here. And then they can get discounts based on conservation practices they do on their home place. And so that's something we've been doing here for about 20 years. Now we're working with Ranchers Stewardship Alliance to start a second grass bank. We purchased a property. We will be transferring it to them in the next year or so. We're working with them to develop a management plan. It's aimed at helping beginning ranchers get a start in the area. So I'm really excited about that and about that model of like, instead of TNC owning it, it will be the local community having input in it. That's been one of the coolest things at the Matador is like people who maybe wouldn't have worked together ended up working together and learning from each other and sharing information and learning from us and vice versa. It's just really cool to see this collaborative approach at solving problems. And camaraderie too, because we live in a very rural and honestly pretty isolated area. I mean, I know people who live over an hour from town on all gravel roads. I think that there is this hidden benefit of collaborating just in terms of helping people feel less alone. I don't know. We're always talking about Montana basically as a mental health crisis in rural areas. And so the more we can build community, I think the better that is for people.
Support comes from the Nature Conservancy. We're working with partners across 7 western states to keep the Sage-Grouse Sea connected, protected, and resilient for wildlife and communities. Learn more at nature.org/sagebrushsea. If you've been listening to earlier episodes of this podcast, you may begin picking up on a theme. Conservation works best in collaboration. When scientists, local communities, governments, landowners, and traditional knowledge keepers combine their efforts, we see greater progress in protecting Earth than if these entities worked all alone. As I've explored bird migrations, experts I've spoken to have reminded me of this powerful truth. And one new technology is a great example of these collaborations. I sat down with my next guest, Edwin Juarez, to learn about automated radio telemetry systems that track bird, bat, and insect movements in real time. Meet Edwin. He's a
bird biologist with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona, and I have been working with our agency for almost over 20 years in the conservation of birds, resident and migratory birds within Arizona, within the Western U.S., and also internationally, recognizing that many of our species migrate south for the winter and breed in the summer or the spring here in Arizona.
Having a long career like that, you must be pretty passionate about this. How did you find yourself in this work?
Well, I think my initial appreciation or embrace for nature in general, it came about from growing up in a small farm in El Salvador near the coast in a kind of tropical deciduous forest sort of environment. My grandmother had a small farm and the kids were responsible for helping out in the farm. So there was this constant awareness of the changing of the season, the growing season for corns, when certain trees ripen their fruits, when we would get to eat certain fruits depending on the time of the year. And also birds coming to those trees to eat those fruits, or people in the rural areas hunting birds for food. So I think all that kind of really raised an awareness about my surroundings, the cycle of nature and the different elements of nature. And one of the typical pastimes at that time for young kids, especially young boys, was to target practice on birds using a slingshot. And I always thought, what a cruel thing to do. So I would never participate in that. But I think that also raised my senses regarding wanting to protect and conserve what's around me. And so I think I would like to attribute my passion for conservation, my appreciation for wildlife, and particularly birds, kind of back to those roots.
So as Edwin's career unfolded, he discovered MODIS, a tracking system that launched in 2014 by Birds Canada, and by 2023 expanded to monitor over 100 species. Today, dozens of MODIS towers can be found across TNC preserves, adding to an ever-expanding network of conservationists using technology as a tool to monitor ecosystems.
Yeah, so MODIS, it's a Latin word that means movement or progress or motion. And so the MODIS wildlife tracking system consists basically of a network of ground stations that are made up of sets of antennas. And as individuals, wildlife such as birds, bats, even butterflies that have been tagged with small transmitters, as they fly over a station, that signal gets picked up by the station. And so we automatically know that a particular individual was in that area. As you grow the network across the hemisphere, you're able to get more observation points because this migration of wildlife, which has occurred forever, we're able to kind of peek into it. We've always had assumptions about where birds or where different wildlife went in certain time of the year, but this technology is really either validating some of those assumptions or really rearranging our beliefs, our awareness, our understanding of how these birds move across an area, a country, a state, or a region. And so I think it's a really powerful tool that is really allowing us to expand our knowledge of movements for this wildlife, most importantly, so that we can think about where there may be impacted in terms of conservation issues, where we may want to focus our attention on. I see it as a strong conservation tool. Just to give you a sense of how big the network is, right now there's over 2,700 stations worldwide across 14 countries. In the Western U.S., which is where I primarily work, we have over almost 700 stations. And in Arizona, we have about 20 active stations. And one of them is on TNC Preserve.
Wow, so this tracking technology is really picking up in popularity. Do you think it's better technology than maybe what we would have used before to understand bird migrations?
I think it's better technology in the sense that it really gives us pinpoint information. So we know when a bird was where. And so that's very valuable information because we know, for example, when it arrived, when it went through an area, or how long it spent in an area. And all that information is very precise. That information also really allows us to learn about the movements and learn and understand what negative impacts may be happening in those areas. In the past, one of the ways we learned about migration was through bird banding, putting little metal rings on the feet of birds in the hope that we would capture them at another time. And so that's a much more tedious, slow process. And the chances of capturing a bird, to look at the band, is very, very low. The MODIS technology has really supercharged, the way we get this kind of movement information.
That's fascinating. I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit more about some of the programs that you are working with TNC on in Arizona and how some of this technology has helped experts like you make decisions.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in Arizona, we have over 500 species of birds. And I'm going to use primarily examples of birds because that's my area of expertise. But, we use this technology on bats and other critters as well. But for birds, we have close to 550 species of birds in Arizona. About 255 of those, they're migratory, which means they either winter in Arizona, pass through Arizona on their way to the wintering grounds further south, or they spend some time in the breeding. So some part of their life cycle it's spent in Arizona. And so many of the species we are concerned about either because we know their numbers are declining or because we do not know what their population numbers are. And so we need to know what their population numbers are so that if there are things that we need to do, we can do those things. Modus technology helps us fill in those knowledge gaps about what we think of as priority species. We have over 155 priority species of birds in the state. And these birds occurred in different habitats in Arizona. In Arizona, I think it's really awesome that we have a whole variety of habitats. We have grasslands, we have forests, we have riparian or river areas. As we deployed Modus stations, we kind of think of it as a targeted approach. We want to make sure we have stations in grasslands areas, in forests, in river areas, because that means we're going to get detection on birds that use these different habitats, that use these different areas. That's where TNC comes in, because several of the properties that TNC manages are riparian areas in the state. And one of them is the TNC preserve on the middle San Pedro River. We've partnered with them and we deployed a station earlier this year. And so I think this is another cool thing about this technology is that really it cultivates partnerships. It brings people together. Game and Fish, my agency, had the funds to actually purchase the equipment for the station. TNC had the property and the infrastructure to host the station and also to kind of keep an eye out on the station. And the other thing, it's a really high priority area for us because it's on the river. Rivers, for a lot of birds, serve as migration corridors. And so we want to maximize our efficiency in terms of where do we want to put a station. And a migration corridor such as a river is a perfect location. And so all those things kind of come together to really make that happen and to maximize the kind of information that we want to get. And also it cultivates that partnership.
Yeah. You mentioned a term earlier. You talked about priority species. And it's one that I think I understand, but could you tell me more about what that means?
One of the species we are getting information on through the Modus network is yellow-billed cuckoos that reproduces or nests in riparian areas in the state and throughout the western U.S. And so over the years, as dams have been put in, and there's a growing population of people, there's less water. And so these river areas have reduced in size. The forests that used to exist along these rivers have shrunk in availability. So there's less habitats for this particular bird. That's one of the birds that is a priority for us. It's listed as threatened. We work with partners to help conserve the species. One of the coolest thing about the yellow-billed cuckoos is their migration cycle. They breed in the rivers in Arizona and other western states, but they winter in South America, fully understanding their movements back and forth, going south for the winter, coming up north for the spring to breed, and what areas they're actually going through when they're going through this migration is really important. And so there's cuckoos on the St. Pedro River where the station is. And so that's the kind of information that comes together for us to really target certain species and think about how can we best conserve them.
Edwin tells me about a recent surprising result from tracking snowy plovers, a small plump shorebird with black markings. It was tagged in Utah on July 18, 2024. Edwin traced this bird's movements all the way to the Sea of Cortez in Mexico on July 23, 2024. In just 6 days, the bird had flown hundreds of miles and stopped at a few key places where conservation is a priority and habitats have been protected. Ultimately, the technology not only affirms conservationists' efforts to restore critical stopover habitat, but it also provides nuance to long-held assumptions about where birds go when they're on the move. In Utah, Modus technology and breeding surveys bring together a community of people hoping to protect migrating shorebirds who fuel up at the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere, the Great Salt Lake. I sat down with Ted Floyd, a conservation ecologist at Tracy Avery in Utah, to talk about his favorite bird, the Wilson's phalarope.
My name is Ted Floyd. I'm a conservation ecologist at Tracy Avery. We're a small bird zoo located in Salt Lake City, Utah. We've partnered with the Nature Conservancy on a number of our projects, including our breeding season surveys at a couple different locations that the TNC manages, including the Shorelands Preserve as well as Legacy Preserve, both located north of Salt Lake City. And then in addition, we have been carrying out shorebird tagging on TNC property, mostly at Legacy Preserve, but a little bit at Shorelands Preserve as well, tagging Wilson's phalaropes. In addition, Tracy Avery hosts a number of MODIS stations at TNC properties in various parts of the state, and we that's kind of a collaboration between TNC, Tracy Avery, as well as the Utah Division of Wildlife. That works to get all those up. And so those MODIS tracking stations are really important to being able to track the migrating birds around the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, well, I can't wait to talk to you about Wilson's phalaropes, but first I wanted to just set the stage here a bit. You know, you must be the kind of person who's really interested in this if you're dedicating your time and your energy to tracking data and supporting conservation organizations like ours. And I wondered if you could tell me a bit about how you first discovered your interest for tracking bird migrations.
Yeah, so I've been bird banding through citizen science projects for a little under 10 years now. And bird banding can provide a lot of really valuable things to science, but it is limited in the information it can provide to us about migration. And I was always kind of looking for ways for us to better learn about migration in some of these programs that I worked with. And I eventually came around to discovering MODIS, which is a technology that is used for tracking migrating birds, also bats and insects as well. It really interested me. It's a lot lower cost than a lot of traditional migration tracking technologies that maybe use GPS technology. The tags were relatively cheap, and I was often working with a really limited budget at the banding programs I was working at. So I thought it would be a really great way for us to get involved in some of this migration research. I eventually convinced the nonprofit I was working for at the time to actually install 2 MODIS stations. So that was how I really jumped into it. And then I was really excited when I got this job because of that focus on migration and being able to study more of those birds. And there's also, in this position that I have, there's also a focus on MODIS technology. So we use that MODIS technology to track all the different birds that we're tracking within our programs.
And why would you say it's so important to be tracking these birds using this high tech?
Well, for a lot of these smaller birds that MODIS can track, some of these tags can be put on hummingbirds even. We didn't have any migratory data on these birds before, and we know that we're living in a changing planet. So understanding just where these birds are moving now before we start to see some of these large-scale changes in the future, we want to have a baseline data source for that. So I think it's really important to understand how these birds are moving so that we can understand in the future what has changed about the way that they're moving through the environment.
Ted hopes MODIS technology will help others in his field understand that stopovers for Wilson's phalaropes, like the Great Salt Lake, are critical. His message is timely as the lake faces decline due to a warming climate and human impacts that have tipped the balance of this fragile stopover habitat. I asked him to help me get to know the Wilson's phalarope, a shorebird he's passionate about protecting.
Yeah, absolutely. So Wilson's phalaropes are a pretty unique bird. One of the really cool things I like to chat about is that they have reversed gender roles. The males actually take care of incubation and raising the young. They mate with the female, and then the female will lay the eggs in the nest, and then she moves on to go lay other nests with other males if she can find another partner. They're really unique birds for that reason. They also almost exclusively use saline habitats, which is unique among shorebirds. They also are like the least shorebird-looking shorebird. They kind of have a weirder body plan than a lot of other shorebirds do. Something that we love to tell people about Wilson's phalaropes, they do these little spinning dances. I encourage you to look videos up on that online. They use it to try and bring food up to the surface of the water that they can eat. It can be really cute. You can go watch them on the causeway of Antelope Island during migration, just spinning constantly along the shore to bring up food for dinner time.
That sounds really cute. And can you tell me, when is their migration season?
Yeah, so they move out a little bit earlier than some of our other birds. The Wilson's phalaropes breed about 2 weeks, and then they're kind of done, maybe 3 weeks if we're lucky. So they breed beginning mid-May, and then by mid-June, they're done with their breeding season, and they have started kind of clustering at the Antelope Island Causeway, where there will be like almost hundreds of thousands of them on certain days. And then eventually that population decides to move on out of the area, and they're kind of completely gone by mid-August. We started to see some of them pop up on our motor stations in Ecuador probably around September this year.
I want to talk about the fact that we are on a changing planet, and I know that humans maybe don't always see or notice the impacts until maybe there's a natural disaster or a hot winter. Or less snow on a mountain that normally has intense snowpack. And there's lots of other examples. I wonder about the impact of climate change to this precious Wilson phalarope, and if you've seen anything or if you're anticipating anything that could impact them or their migration pattern.
Yeah, well, I think the risk is absolutely huge right now. I mean, we're just seeing it in Utah right now. There's been very little snowpack this year. It's the worst conditions since I've moved here. It's just warmer. I think we had our warmest December on record by, someone told me it was by 10 degrees, which is wow. Really crazy. I mean, I was taken back by that. I haven't checked on that statistic, but it is crazy to see this really warm weather that we're experiencing. And that's going to play a huge role in the habitat that these birds use. If we don't get that snowpack moving to the Great Salt Lake, the lake is going to lose water this year. And we are very worried about the long-term health of the lake without that snowpack. And we're concerned about the birds being able to access food while they're stopping over at Great Salt Lake, while they're on their migration journeys. In particular, we did have the lake ecosystem crash a few years ago when it got really low and dried out. The brine flies and the brine shrimp that the birds rely on actually died out. The lake got too saline for them. And that only lasted a few months, thankfully. We were able to get some more fresh water into the lake to help save it. But it's a ticking time bomb, and we're really nervous about it. There is currently a petition for the Wilson's phalarope to be listed as endangered because of this risk related to the lake. When you have such a high percentage of the population using this lake as a fueling stop for that migration, and a significant portion of the population using Great Salt Lake as a breeding site, we're really worried for these birds and their future.
Like many conservation efforts, protection of lands, waters, and natural resources is directly linked to the relationship people have with a place. This sense of connection drives people like Tully to devote themselves to ensuring the area thrives for generations to come. But what happens when a place gets a bad rap or community members lose their sense of connection to it? Well, I asked Tully about some of the underlying social dynamics he thinks are tied to the Great Salt Lake's decline.
Yeah, it's really uniquely beautiful. It can also be a little saddening at times because you can see its kind of active decline in some ways. We can see the areas that used to have water that have dried up since. It's such a harsh ecosystem, and I think a lot of Utahns aren't really well connected with it, or they have a bad relationship with the lake. But it really is just a beautiful spot in our country. I think a lot of Utahns have just grown up seeing the lake as kind of like that dirty spot that they stayed away from. And they don't have that like great connection. I was just talking to some Argentinian researchers at Laguna Marchita. They have like beach resorts along their saline lakes and stuff like that. So they have, it's like a vacation spot for people. And sadly, because of the way that our lake has been polluted by the mining and other economic activities that have happened around it, we just don't have that same connection where it's like safe. You can go swimming, don't swallow the water. But it's not like a place people go to necessarily have fun. So we are trying to just bring it more attention to the lake and its importance, especially to the local Utah population, and really connecting them with it. We do a lot of bird tours out there and stuff. We also have a project with snowy plovers where we're trying to engage the public to connect with the lake through I mean, what's just the cutest little bird you could ever imagine. So they just didn't grow up having that, like, their parents explaining to them that this is an important part of their environment. It was kind of just that dirty spot in the corner that we were all going to ignore. So yeah, I'm happy to see that a lot of Utahns are trying to find ways to better connect with the lake. That's been exciting to see as a community as we've tried to come together to help save it, really. And we have been able to see that in the state. You know, I'm not completely out of hope about the lake. I think we do have really great opportunities to save it if we do come together. And we are starting to see some of that here as we watch the government get more involved in something that they're concerned about, and as we are concerned about it as well. If you ever have the chance to make it out here, Antelope Island is absolutely gorgeous. It's an island in the middle of the lake. Anyone can drive out to it. It's a state park. It's my favorite place to take guests when I come out here, just so they can just see how big this thing is and how important it is, and it's playing this central role in our ecosystem. And there's a lot of risks if we lose the lake. The lake has a lot of heavy metals and other things that we have to worry about that could get into dust storms if it does completely dry up. So this isn't just about saving the birds. It's also about saving the humans a little bit. So being able to get people to connect with the lake in that way, it's really magical.
I really appreciate you telling me about it. It sounds like an idyllic spot to go visit and really just see one of those wonders in the country. I'm sure that they don't call it great for no reason.
Yeah.
For my listeners who are interested in experiencing the Great Salt Lake for themselves and maybe spotting a Wilson's phalarope, Tully suggests that you
come on out to Antelope Island. Causeway is probably one of the best places to see them throughout the year. Or at least during the migration season in the spring and fall. You can see a lot of them along that causeway. It's a great place to connect with them, a great place to bird if you're ever at the Great Salt Lake. But these birds are all over the west of the United States. Mono Lake in California has a huge migration of them. I know there's places that they breed in Oregon and Northern California. So there's lots of places where you can try and find this bird to connect with them, connect with their saline habitat, and really find ways to appreciate these birds. So I encourage folks to go out and learn more about them if they can.
This has been On the Move, a podcast about wild animals, their amazing migrations, and how people are freeing them up from anything standing in their way. In the next episode, we'll explore ungulates, hoofed animals, migrating across the western U.S. and Canada. And remember Kelsey from earlier in this episode? Well, she says researchers at the University of Montana discovered a surprising correlation between migrating sage-grouse and pronghorn.
And seeing that they actually had a lot of parallels. So both species, their Canadian population is coming across the border into the slightly milder Montana winter. So then when they lined up the data, they found they're both migrating at about the same time of year, both in spring and fall. They're also migrating through basically similar pathways.
More on that in the next episode. Thanks to my wonderful guests, celebrity birder Ted Floyd, Kelsey Malloy, Edwin Juarez, and Tully Frayne. And as always, thanks to my storytelling team, the creative powerhouse behind On the Move. This episode was written and produced by Leah Palmer with support from Kate O'Neill and Dustin Solberg. Custom artwork was created by Erica Simek-Sloniker with support from Mitch Maxon. Web and social production come from Danielle Kagan and Tracy Swift. Find more from this series at nature.org/onthemove.